So I'm Henry from Team Cultural Studies.
And I'm Liz from Team Critical Theory.
So we're sort of making fun a little bit of the framing of this discussion, in part because I think what's exciting about this event is we're bringing together multiple tribes at this conference. The critical studies people who've thought deeply about the affordances of new media, the challenges of commercialization, some of the issues that have emerged around social media networks, with people like myself who come from more of a cultural studies background and have been particularly involved in the MacArthur Digital Media and Learning Initiative. And I think, so often out there we are pit against each other. We're sort of in, it's a divide and conquer strategy that dismisses left-wing perspectives on education, on media and culture. And our theoretical issues divide us rather than allowing us to find ways to complement each other, to work together. And I think it's vitally important right now as we deal with any number of crises in American society, whether it's the crisis of capitalism represented by Occupy Wall Street, or it's the crisis of education that we're discussing here, for us to bridge those divides and to find ways to collaborate and to build on each other's work, to learn from each other's challenges to our own perspectives, to construct models that include both structure and agency in ways that allow us to build a more critical voice in the conversations that matter. And that's really what I think Liz and I are entering into the discussion here today.
Because I think one of the things we're interested in is how we can sort of think about these complementary perspectives that both encourage participation enthusiastically and raise issues about infrastructure and ideology that might invite certain forms of skepticism. But I think one of the things that we both share is a commitment to building actual programs, to dealing with issues on the ground, and to exiting the armchair whenever we can to actually deal with the challenges of participatory culture. And it might be helpful to provide a little framing there for that word, since that's one of the words that's sort of critical to convergence culture.
Yeah, well, I think your word skepticism is the right one. And I think on both sides, being too firm in our theoretical perspective can lead to cynicism. A sense that there's nothing we can do to change anything. There's no possibility of progress, that the struggles are already lost. Whereas skepticism suggests an open-mindedness, a willingness to explore other alternatives, and a willingness to ask hard questions of our own positions as well as others. So in framing the conference, we're using the term participatory culture, and it's a term I've been using for almost 20 years in my work, but as a consequence, it's a term that's been rethought and re-engaged with many times in my work, and often to some confusion. So I wanted to begin by saying a little bit about what I mean now by participatory culture, because it's a concept that I think's evolved. And the first point I'd make is what I do not mean by participatory culture is Web 2.0. Right? Participatory culture, it comes from bottom up. It is a set of social and cultural practices. It's not a technological set of practices or affordances. It is a way we live and struggle with our relationships to media. For me, participatory culture is the promise of a world where people can take media in their own hands and make a difference on a local level in their relationship to culture. To my mind, it's the inheritor of 150 years of struggle over access to media technologies and struggles over educational rights, over the right to participate, over the infrastructure and framework of society. So when I think about participatory culture, I go back to someone like Brecht, who talked about radio and urged radio to be a medium that has as many transmitters as receivers. Or I think about Eisenberger's work in 1970, who laid a theoretical framework for a more participatory culture. Or I think about some of the countercultural politics of the 1960s that built student presses and underground comics and underground radio stations to try to empower people to have the capacity to communicate more effectively their ideas to larger publics. So for me, the notion of participatory culture is at its core a progressive challenge to the dominance of a small number of institutions over the society. It's a radical idea. It also happens to be an idea that's embedded in everyday practices, whether we're talking about the Samba schools in Brazil that Seymour Papert wrote about, or whether we're talking about the fan cultures I've written about, or the gaming cultures James Paul G has discussed, people are finding new social structures which support participation in meaningful ways. Web 2.0 is a business model, pure and simple, and it's a business model designed to capture and commodify participation. So all of the criticism that I think Critical Studies has leveled against Web 2.0 is largely justifiable. There's no opposition from me to that. When I wrote in Convergence Culture about participatory culture, it was before the word Web 2.0 was defined, and I did not see that model necessarily emerging in the ways that it did. And so ever since, I've been pushing back on Web 2.0 because I think it's very much not what I'm advocating in participatory culture. And I think when we use terms like Learning 2.0 in our discussions, we do disservice to the real struggles over participatory culture, that by taking a buzzword from industry and apply it to education, that's about the commodifying of attention and should be exactly the opposite of what we as a community are working to build through our work.
Now, of course, one of the things about participatory culture that I'm interested in is the ways that institutions might mimic the forms of participatory culture, and how institutions are often in a kind of difficult position because they are both content creators by necessity and regulators. And so we have situations where we have governments, universities, and corporations producing digital media as well as regulating it and controlling it. And so kind of making sense of how participatory culture practices fit into institutional frameworks, I think is something that is difficult. And I think it's important to kind of acknowledge the realpolitik of that. And not necessarily say that the first solution is to blow up the university. That as entertaining as that might be, to watch it go up in flames, that instead we have to think about the institutions that we have now, the inheritances that we bring to the table. And I think one of the things that I like about your work is you're always interested in this question of historical context, so that we can look at things like educational technology in a larger framework, where we can look at over a century of educational technology initiatives and think about how those attitudes inform our ideas about both education and democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think this rhetoric about blowing up schools, is very satisfying on an emotional level. I think we all know the frustration we feel with the current institutions and structures. But we also probably realistically know that's not what's going to happen. I think it's very important that there be people out there advocating blowing up the schools, proposing alternatives, creating new experiments and structures outside of the school system that push and prod us forward. Right? But I also think it's vitally important that those of us in this room, work with classroom teachers, librarians, museums, and public institutions that are on the ground now making a difference in the lives of young people. That I met so many teachers in the work that I've been doing over the last decade in education who are struggling individually and collectively under incredibly harsh circumstances to try to make a difference for kids, to try to push their schools in a more progressive direction, to try to introduce more participatory practices into the classroom. For us to sort of say we're not going to deal with that public education anymore and walk away would be criminal. That we have an obligation to those people to support their struggles to make a difference on the ground. And so I get frustrated when I hear rhetoric about just why don't we shut it down and reboot, because realistically that's not what's going to happen here. And it's useful to think outside of its frameworks, but it's also vital to work within it, as I think both of us do on a pretty regular basis.
And I was listening to Anya Kamenitz's talk last night about self-learning. And I was listening to it and I was thinking, well, okay, how do I learn? If there's something that I know that I don't know, and it's going to be difficult to learn, and it's going to take a certain amount of commitment, and it's something important, so I'm going to have to either teach it to other people or test it out in a high-stakes situation. I actually do what 2.6 million other Californians do, which I enroll in a community college class. And I will take a class in computer programming, or I will take a class in web design, or I will take a class in learning to use Adobe After Effects for 2 semesters, or I will take a class in Japanese or a class in German, because that's the way that I feel that I can do my self-learning. And I would say that there are certain virtues to that, that I don't go to the web, I don't go to a hackerspace when I want that knowledge. And I'm going into a situation in which there's going to be a very diverse population of learners, because it's in the context of public access and transparency and a support and a commitment to diversity that that learning takes place. So I'm in a classroom with senior citizens, I'm in a classroom with high schoolers, I'm in a classroom with high-functioning autistics, I'm in a classroom where there are people who are jobless people in their 40s, and there are also hipsters in their 20s. And we have an opportunity to all learn together thanks to the interests of the state. And I think that it's important to sort of not leave that piece out of the equation, because there are a lot of people who find learning that way too.
We were talking about this over at breakfast. I've never actually done a community college course, and I'm impressed. But every degree I have is from a public institution that I've been lucky enough in my career to teach at 2 elite universities, and I don't make any pretense of that. But I went through public schools. All of my degrees are from public universities, and I benefited from the public education system in profound ways. And I'm very concerned about what I call the participation gap, which is not access to technology, but access to skills, experiences, knowledge, which allow people to meaningfully participate. And the only infrastructure we have right now that is going to combat the participation gap is that provided by public education and public institutions. That's the only equalizer. Anything we imagine we do that involves blowing up the schools and working outside of the system means working with elite groups of kids. Now, they may be low-income kids that money's being poured into. They may be gifted kids. They may be private school kids. They may be people who can afford after-school programs because they don't have to work after school. But one way or another, the people who benefit from the informal learning space the most are those who are already benefited by other structures in the society. And if we don't bring this stuff into our schools, if we don't bring it into the public libraries, then we are in real trouble.
And I thought it was interesting when Hassan Alahi was talking yesterday that there was a moment in which he actually showed the receipt for how much those iPads to his honor students cost. And I think part of that is when we're in public institutions, we have this obligation to transparency, to showing how much of the taxpayers' money we spend and on what. And I thought it was also interesting that he showed a slide about the demographic makeup of students in his program to show the diversity of learners who are taking advantage of these resources. And that's an important component of public education. And I think that institutional sense of justice can be something, and sense of history can be something that can be embraced as well as attacked.
So that said, I should say right away that I am emphatically not a technological determinist. That despite teaching at MIT for 20 years, my position there was always to insist on the centrality of the social, the political, the cultural, to understanding the changes that are taking place. But our ability to bring participatory culture into the classroom is bound up with our ability to, the charm, the appeal, the snap of things that go ping. Technologies, tools, toys, devices, gadgets, whatever we want to call it. The school system will let those in the door. And as it does so, we have a moment of framing what they mean and how they're used. And right now, we've wired the classroom and disabled the computer, right? And this is a matter of public policy. We've connected federal dollars to mandatory filtering on computers in school. That our schools now disable YouTube and Facebook and MySpace and Twitter and Flickr and all of the other platforms of Web 2.0, which, as I said, are not the same as participatory culture, but probably the most accessible way of engaging with participatory culture in the classroom. So when we did a project on Moby Dick in the schools in New England, we discovered you couldn't get information about Herman Melville's book because it had the word dick in its title, which reduces the school computer to the level of a sniggering fifth grader, right? We discovered in the schools in Los Angeles where we've been doing work that teachers can't, while it's true they can work around to get access to individual YouTube videos, the code will only last a very short period of time. So you can't even punch in all the codes for all the videos you might want to show in a single class period. You have to stop the instructional time each moment, punch in the code, and work around the system then and there in order to bring a video, which creates an incredible encumbrance. The teachers who want to take advantage of the content of YouTube in their classes. That this process is one that is fundamentally breaking our ability to engage meaningfully with participatory culture in the classroom. So this is where we could be frustrated, and this is why schools are worth fighting for, is that we have to put a collective front on calling out the policies that currently disable schools from being able to engage in meaningful ways with participatory learning practices.
And that's one thing where Henry and I completely agree. Sorry, my instant reaction is that we have to disagree. But we agree that the classroom has become like totalitarian China inside a typical public school. And in fact, sitting in the back is one of my two kids who was a public school product. And he and his brother both compared notes on how to get around the school filtering software. And apparently there's a whole kind of informal learning culture within schools about how to kind of get the passwords and find workarounds to get around these incredibly onerous systems that make it impossible for you to get out to the open web or anything that would actually encourage play or informal sociality or mentoring or any resource finding or any of the other things that we want to encourage.
You know, and these policies are not just the beginning of some of the challenges that I think our teachers are facing. We've been doing teacher training in the LA Unified School District this summer, and we heard stories like a teacher who 70% of his colleagues get gutted over the summer. And the sense of anxiety these teachers feel about anything that's innovative or experimental in a context where any mistake can result in them being let go because the administrators are looking for reasons to cut people from the payroll. These are teachers who are terrified of peer-to-peer review because teachers have been set in competition with each other rather than able to collaborate in any sort of organic, coherent school ecology that allows them to work together. This is the school system where my fantasy is that the librarian plays a crucial role in this process of being an information coach, a participation coach, someone who helps people access resources, opportunities. But in the LA school system, all of the librarians were fired this past year. So at the Robert F. Kennedy School, which we've been teaching in, has a state-of-the-art facility, one of the most expensive school facilities in the country, has a huge, beautiful library that just opened last year. And at the end of its first year of operation, all library services got cut off. So that the things that we're imagining, the hopes we have for a more participatory environment, are at risk if we don't engage directly with the politics of education on a community and national level, because these are the things that make it impossible. So it's not just the regimes of standardized testings which push against any notion of collective intelligence because they assume the only knowledge or individual expertise because they assume that the only knowledge that matters is that everyone either knows or doesn't know. But it's these deeper things that affect our ability to provide any sort of reliable infrastructure for participation in the classroom that we have to push against if we're going to make the kinds of differences that those of us involved in the kind of educational enterprises being discussed at this conference are concerned with.
And I think following up from that, I'd give a plug for the research of Francois Barr, looking at both the role of infomediaries, how do we understand the way that people serve as important search engines for people both in the developing world and in our own society as a way to kind of get access to the internet. What does it mean to have an expert user of a computer portal who can guide you to the right information in a meaningful way? And also thinking about the importance of public computing, which many libraries serve, and thinking about kind of getting away from this sort of individual consumer gadget model and think about the kinds of public spaces that support computational media and our engagement with technology. I would, of course, say that there's certain promise in kind of going right to the center. I go back to Michael Wesch talking about the kind of critical mass that you get when you're at a large public institution, you have these big lecture hall classes, that there are ways to sort of see the scale as actually an asset rather than a liability, and to encourage you sometimes to aim for the center rather than just work out on the margins. Because sometimes going for large populations of learners in public institutions can be a way to really affect substantive change. And I know that's one of the things that you've tried to do working with school districts and working with relatively large populations of students.
I mean, the other things that give me hope, I mean, I'm eternally the glass half full, if not 2/3 full kind of guy, right? And some of the things that give me hope in the midst of some frustrations with where our ability to change education are going. One is the fact that we can do some of these changes with no tech, if not low tech, right? So that when we work on new media literacies materials through our project, we're really urging people not to wait until the technological infrastructure is in place at the individual school. If you wait until everything's perfect, you're never going to get there. That the struggle has to be working with whatever you've got and making it work, because what we're talking about, again, goes back to social, cultural skills, not just technical skills and technical infrastructure. So the capacity to negotiate, to network, to play, to perform, to appropriate and remix are all things that can be taught at a more low-tech level. And this worked out really well for one of my grad students, Laurel Felt, who was working in Senegal last summer. And was going to do a new media literacies workshop all summer at a school in Senegal. And the power generator went out at the beginning of the term, and she had no power to teach new media for the entire summer. And so she was able to use locally appropriate things like clotheslines and tags to sort of call out the media literacies and to do activities that focused on the skills, not on the technologies, and still made a difference in the life of these African youth. The other story that gives me hope is the story of Relly Zimmerman, who's in my research team that we're working with MacArthur on civic engagement. And we're studying the dream activist. These are young, mostly undocumented youth who have been developing an incredibly sophisticated set of tactics for getting the word out, for communicating their concern. They use Facebook, they use Twitter, they use YouTube. They're building videos where they sort of come out as undocumented. And contrary to Malcolm Gladwell, who wants us to make online activism sound safe and secure, when you come out as undocumented, you run a high risk of being deported. And many of these young people are being deported for speaking out on issues that affect their community. And as they're being deported, they're tweeting on the planes as they're being shipped away because they refuse to go silently into the night like previous generations of undocumented youth. They're connecting across ethnic communities, unlike previous immigrant right movements. And they're connecting across states at a time the battle has shifted from national to local struggles over immigrant rights. And they are doing so with great courage and great ingenuity. And when we interviewed them, most of them do not have home computers. Most of them are taking advantage of whatever they can get through schools and public libraries in order to continue their struggle. So they're filmmakers who don't have cameras. They're bloggers who don't have computers. And they're taking advantage of whatever the system provides to allow them to do the work that what they're trying to accomplish through their activism.
And I think that brings us back to kind of where we've seen this group of educators go in the past couple of years. And I think one of the best things that's happened is we don't see as many 3D games as something, an expensive system built on a game engine that's required in order to do learning. And so you see things like Tracy Fullerton's Pathfinder game, which is about thinking critically about what it takes to get into college if you're a working class kid who doesn't really know how to game the system, or think about what gets rewarded and what gets punished when it comes to applying for college. And I think that you also see the benefits of a low-tech solution even at a high-tech institution like UC San Diego, where we have students in the Culture, Art, and Technology world-making class with Wayne Yang, actually producing DIY graphic novel projects and then doing their own Comic-Con, where they dressed up in costume and made T-shirts, and I'm a big fan of themed attire when in doubt. But these students were really engaged, and when we looked at the evaluations, this is a course that has sometimes gotten evaluations as low as like in the 30% from students in terms of students feeling like they got something out of the course. And this had evaluations that were 99%. Now, when you're talking about a large lecture hall course where you get over 99% of the students feeling like it was a meaningful educational experience that they could cap off the freshman year, that's something that's really exciting. And that's something that you don't need smart boards or iPads or any of these other gizmos in order to do. It's about engagement and community.
Yeah, I mean, I'm impressed getting 99%, I have to say. I mean, I've had some experiences more recently than I knew you have that have been a bit more bruising than that, right? And they point to some of the challenges, again, of bringing participatory culture into a learning environment.
Right, so that you want to empower students in the lecture hall by having them use those mobile devices in ways that can facilitate more learning, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes in the case of when I brought we were celebrating Diversity Day, and I was doing a series of readings and talks about deaf YouTube and how YouTube is used by different disability communities in connection with this public rhetoric online course. And a group of students actually used Twitter to orchestrate a coughing incident where they all coughed simultaneously in the middle of the speaker coming to my classroom with his translator and with the class of sign language interpreters who were learning from the translator's work. And the student said, this was like the Arab Spring. We were, challenging the authority of the classroom, and we're, reacting against factory-style learning, and we're taking our agency. And it's like, oh, but did you have to do it that day? Couldn't you have done it another day when there weren't other people there? But I think there are situations in which you can actually learn and negotiate in those situations. And I think that's one of the things that Henry and I have been talking about is kind of how do you figure out how to talk about a pedagogy that's appropriate for when people either participate inappropriately or not at all. Like sort of how do we make participatory culture work? And Henry's been, and I have been sort of talking about some of these kind of basic principles. So, I mean, what do you do when something goes wrong in your pedagogical experiments? When you sort of think that you're empowering them and instead all hell breaks loose?
I mean, you've got a story where people became overly participatory. My experience in the lecture hall class has been at USC has been somewhat the opposite, right? That USC's standards of admissions have gone up to the point that we mostly have A, B students, but there are students who have struggled to make A's and B's, have assimilated a system, where they do exactly what's required to get that A and B, and the result is a lot of the initiative for participation has gone way, way down. And I'm struggling, often we talk about educational reform, we imagine we're liberating the students so that they can become creators and participators. What I found is I open up the doors and students look at me like, so where are the lines? Tell me what you want in the exam. How do I achieve what you're seeking? Because they are products of a process of standardized education, and you can't just remove the standards, having set those rails in place, and expect people to fly. And I think a lot of the pessimism about some of the experiments in schools that fail grow out of the sense that we expect people just to be liberated overnight, that we expect people to have the skills and the ingenuity and the creativity to be full participants just because we remove the obstacles or we make technologies available. And we have to actually grapple with the mindsets that have been structured by the educational system that require some help. There's, other parts of the world, there are long traditions of pedagogies of liberation that are in place to help people who have been under oppressive regimes gain their voice, gain their autonomy, gain the power to participate. And those are things we in this country have to learn, because our students, if we open up at the higher ed level room for participation, the students who come through the high stakes test regime need to be liberated from institutional constraints that they've set on themselves in order to be able to meaningfully participate in a more open-ended educational structure.